That's an exception, that's not the rule. So if you have a project that's going to be going down that route, and I'd also like to add that this came up in discussion as well, and if you're still proposing BMPs for those linear type of projects, you're going to fill it out with impervious, meadow, or woods, and then you're going to be going towards the MRC rather than going towards the post-construction, or rather going towards adjusting the curve numbers. That came up as a question. Yeah. So next up, we're going to have, this is where you're going to be listing your BMPs and where the BMPs and how you're going to be meeting your requirements. This was a change in version 1.5. So up here, if you have a pervious undetained area, you'd be checking that, entering it in here. Basically what that's doing is eliminating anything that you're not disturbing. So if you don't have a disturbance in a portion of the project, you're not required to provide rate, volume, and water quality for that portion that you're not disturbing. Then you'll have a chance to enter some tree planting credit, and then you have an other box. So, and these are all of your non-structural BMPs that you're going to be putting in here. If you are taking other non-structural BMPs, you're going to be putting a description in here of what that BMP is. That could be disconnection, it could be protecting sensitive natural areas, so on and so forth. You're going to put the credit that you're claiming in here, and then that drops it, that is taken into consideration in the calculations on the bottom. And I know some folks in the back can't see very well on the very bottom, so I'll describe that a little more as we get to it. Then you come up to your structural BMP credit, and again, you're going to enter in the number of structural BMPs that you have, and then how you're going to start your numbering. And so that will auto-populate 4 boxes. It'll give you your numbering, or your BMP numbers, and then you start and this is what drainage area it's in. The BMP name, again, it should all be correlating back to the BMP manual, correlating back to your plans, correlating back to the NOI and the modules, and they should all be consistent. Now, whether or not they're in series, obviously if it's the first one, it can't be. And then the BMP drainage area, the drainage area impervious. So basically you're just going to be populating this from the information that you've provided elsewhere. Then same drainage area, BMP number 2. This time it happens to be a rain garden / bioretention. And you'll note that this one is in series with the infiltration trench. So you then drop in your BMP areas, your volumes, so on and so forth, and then it'll calculate the credits down here. And something new is the evapotranspiration credit that you'll get for some of these BMPs. Now, the new BMP manual speaks to evapotranspiration and puts much more credit that's available for some of these BMPs. So right now, this calculation isn't really known to us because it's all happening within the spreadsheet, and it's based on a manual that hasn't been put out to the public yet. So for right now, you just need to use it and take the credit. When you get the new manual, you'll see it does make some sense. It's basically looking at major impoundments in the area that you're working, and it's sort of relating what happens to that impoundment to what's happening on your site. It's much more inclusive when you look at what you have been getting, which is the 7%, which when you really look at it doesn't amount to much. So this will be a higher credit for you. And then it just kind of calculates and comes down here and looks at your reduction, your required release credit, and then the change in volume. And you'll see at the very bottom, it says volume requirement satisfied. So basically, if your volume credits are equal to or greater than your required volume reduction, you get this green message and it says, good job. So rate control, I'm not going to spend much time. I really don't see this being used very frequently. It's here, it's a tool at your disposal if you really want to venture and use it. But I would say you're much better off utilizing whatever computer packages you have and including those printouts with the report. Now kind of to the important part of this, which is the quality. Now, like I alluded to earlier, you have to utilize this spreadsheet for water quality unless you're doing an alternative design standard. Now, the first thing you're going to notice is you have land cover from the volume worksheet, and then you have land cover for water quality. Anybody know why we have two different ones? So the reason why we have two different ones is because this may be, impervious can mean a lot of things. It can mean rooftop, it can mean streets, it can mean parking lots, it can mean a lot of different impervious. What this does, impervious mixed use, this actually identifies where these numbers are coming from. So where the pollutant loading is being generated. So if you think back to worksheets 12 and 13, you had to identify different pollutant loads by different cover types because every cover type has a slightly different pollutant loading. So that's why it's broken out. But they're relating it back to the land cover because of your volume. So this is basically telling it to go back to the volume tab, look it up, and based on this cover, this land cover, it's going to give you a volume. Which is pretty nice because now you don't have to go and separately calculate that volume and then plug that number in. It does it automatically for you and then generates your pollutant loadings. So, second part, similar situation. It's going to be referring back to the post-construction with these curve numbers, with these land covers, and then you're going to further identify exactly what that land cover consists of as it relates to the pollutant loadings. It's going to automatically calculate that based on the volume that is calculated, again, back from the volume tab. And then at the end, you'll see the pollutant load reduction requirements. So this is going to tell you what you need to meet. The biggest difference that you're going to notice here is that it's no longer, as in worksheet 12 and 13, it only looked at the post-development condition. It's now looking at the difference between the pre-development and post-development, which makes compliance much easier because you're just looking at that difference rather than the totals at the end, which is similar to the way worksheets 14 and 15 were set up for riparian buffers. Now you're going to get into where you're identifying your BMPs, identifying the credits, and and, sorry. Your reductions, and then it'll go through and calculate out your reductions down here. And again, you get a green message if you've provided enough BMPs to take care of that difference in water quality for TSS, total TP, and TN. So now we're going to talk a little bit about the anti-DEG analysis module, which is module 3. This is similar to the old NOI where they had the anti-DEG analysis part 1 and part 2, where they talked about non-discharge alternatives and as well as ABACT BMPs. It's required for all individual applications with discharges to special protections, so that's HQ and EV, and surface waters that are impaired for those impairments, which we talked about sort of earlier. Now, there's a slight difference between PAG02 and IPs, and that is that you don't necessarily have to follow you can either provide non-discharge alternatives or ABACT. You kind of don't have to follow that flow, but in most instances, you're probably going to be using a combination of both anyway, because very few BMPs can reduce the rate, volume, and water quality for the 2-year storm, which we'll talk about as we go through this. So at the top of this, you're going to be filling out the basic information that you're going to see on just about every one of the modules. Then it talks about non-discharge alternatives. So again, nothing new here. You used to do this on the old NOI. All the BMPs are here, and this happens to be for the ENS. Again, you had to do it for ENS before. So identify the ENS BMPs that will be used for non-discharge alternatives. You're going to list them here. If there's an other, you're going to check this box and indicate here what that other BMP is. Most times you won't be checking other, you'll be utilizing some of these BMPs. And again, this is the during construction component of everything. Then you'll explain how they will individually or collectively eliminate the net change in stormwater volume rate and quality for storms up to and including the 2-year 24-hour during earth disturbance activities. Now, if you recall back in the NOI, there was a section where you had to, that was module 1, where you had to describe qualitatively what your storms were like. This is going to relate back to that. Most times, you're not going to be able to say that you're eliminating the rate, volume, and water quality for storm events up to including the 2-year. So you'll have to come down here, give an explanation as to why the non-selected non-discharge alternatives, I don't know why I have a hard time with that, weren't considered, and then you're going to move on to the ABACT analysis. So again, you'll notice a lot of these, all of these come right from the BMP manual. They're all checked with ABACT BMPs and how they are applicable into what HQ or EV or both. So you're going to come through, check all your BMPs. Now, at the end, explain how the BMPs will individually or collectively manage the net and stormwater rate volume, storm events up including the 2-year 24-hour storm. So again, this is going to be an explanation. It's going to be a qualitative explanation. If you're employing BMPs and everything from the site is going off to those BMPs. Essentially, that's what your discussion is going to include. So module 3 continued. Sorry. So now we're getting into the post-construction stormwater implementation of the anti-DEG. Very similar to the ENS, except there's different BMPs here. Again, if you're not managing the rate volume water quality up to and including the 2-year 24-hour storm, you're going to need to explain why, and explain why any other non-discharge alternatives weren't selected. And again, most instances, you're going to have to provide ABAC BMPs. So now we come to the ABAC BMP section, and nothing new other than they identify more ABAC BMPs that you can utilize. Check which ones you're including. Now, just because you're checking it doesn't mean that's all that you have to do. If you're checking an ABAC BMP here, you need to make sure that that BMP appears, number one, on your plans. Happens a lot. Saying it so doesn't make it so. So you need to make sure that it appears in your plans, and then also appears through your NOI or your application and through your other modules. That's really important, because the consistency here, part of the reason why this was developed is to help with that consistency, because we've been seeing a lot of applications come through that have very inconsistent names, BMPs that we've never heard of before, so we don't even know how to review them, where in fact, when you actually look at the BMP, it is an infiltration trench that's identified in the BMP manual, but somebody decided to call it an infiltration ditch or something like that. So you go through, you identify your BMPs, making sure that they're provided throughout your report, throughout your plan, so on and so forth, and then again explain how the BMPs will manage the net change up to the 2-year 24-hour storm event. And then you have to go through this certification that the applicant actually needs to sign, and they're certifying that what's being provided is accurate. Riparian buffer module number 4. So this is special protection, HQEV. And this is if you have, if you're working, or if the project site is within 150 feet of an intermittent perennial river, stream, creek, lake, pond, or reservoir with a designated use of HQ or EV. We have a lot of these in Monroe County and in Pike County as well. So again, you start off with the typical information. You're going to be selecting what type of permit you have. We're today only going to be speaking to the individual NPDES permit, so you'll see that a lot of the things here listed are not applicable, such as waivers, because waivers are no longer available for individual permits. They're only available for the ENS permits. So they go through and list all of the exemptions from 102.14, whether it be road maintenance, repair of existing pipelines and utilities, oil and gas, timber harvesting, yada, yada, yada. Single-family home that is not part of a larger plan of common plan of development and was acquired by the applicant prior to November 19th, 2010. That date's important. And then activities authorized by a DEP permit under other regulations which contain setback requirements, and you're meeting those setback requirements. So those are the exemptions. Most common are probably going to be the top two. Those are the ones that we see most frequently, and you may have portions of your project that are applicable for road maintenance or repair, and then you'd have other parts of your project that are not. So the way that you would fill this out is, if a portion of it is, you would check it, but you're also going to have to fill out the remaining portions as we go through. So these are the allowable activities, again, as defined in 102.14. There's nothing new here. These have been allowable activities. They are allowable activities, as so are the exemptions that we just went through. Probably the biggest one that we see are these two: restoration project and then water obstruction encroachments. And so basically, if you're getting a 105 permit, those areas within the 105 jurisdiction come out. Now we get a little bit more into what's actually happening within that riparian buffer. So are you going to have any earth disturbance within that 150-foot buffer? If you do, you mark yes. If you don't, you mark no, and then you get to skip some things here. If yes, you want to talk, they're going to ask you, is 150-foot minimum riparian buffer will be implemented? An equivalency demonstration will be required. Applicants seeking a waiver. So you're going to identify what's actually happening here. Are you actually going to be utilizing the riparian buffer? Are you disturbing it? And if you are disturbing it, you're going to need to provide an equivalency demonstration. And yes, we are disturbing it, but it's a waiver. And that's only for E&S permits. That's important to note, because waivers are no longer available for individual permits. And then, will the project site exist within 150 feet? Yada, yada, yada. Yes. This is where we're going to talk about, are you going to be providing the buffer? Again, is it an equivalency demonstration? Or E&S permits you can seek for a waiver. And then if you're establishing, it kind of gives you a little bit more information here that you need to fill out and identify the species, average minimum widths, buffer linear lengths, and then whether or not a riparian buffer management plan has been included in the PCSM plan. So if you're providing a buffer, you need to provide the management plan. And then how will that buffer that's being planned to be protected? Deed restriction, conservation easement, or other. Some municipalities have done ordinances. There are a number of ways to provide protection. So the equivalency demonstration. So this is only if you're disturbing within that first 100 feet. So, and this is in addition to the water quality component that you had to fill out in the spreadsheets. You'll need to provide worksheet 12 and 13 and worksheets 14 and 15. So you'll be filling out that spreadsheet, and then you'll be also filling out worksheets 12, 13, 14, and 15 and providing BMPs to meet those water quality requirements, as well as water quality requirements needed for the NPDES. You'll also need to provide a checklist and sort of an alternatives to make sure that the BMPs that you are selecting are functionally equivalent for the riparian buffer or the riparian forest buffer that you're removing from your site. So you want to make sure that the BMPs you're proposing are going to provide the same functions that that riparian buffer had. And then they talk about offsetting. Will there be any disturbance within 100 feet of a surface water? If there's yes, you'll need to provide offsetting. And offsetting is basically providing riparian forested buffer either on-site or off-site at a 1-to-1 ratio. So again, this is nothing new. This has been in the regulation for a while. Just the information and how it's presented has changed. So we're going to go through and identify, you're going to add up all your disturbances. Now, this is all of your disturbance, whether it's within that first 50 feet or within that first 150 feet. Or it's all the disturbance within the buffer. And then you proposed offsite area. These have to at least match. If you want to propose more, you certainly can. And then this kind of goes into the siting. There's a hierarchy in the guidance that says, you know, you need to have it within either on-site or within the same drainage list, so on and so forth. So this kind of just takes you through that hierarchy, and then as you identify the property name and address, makes you identify that that you have the authorization to do the buffer on that property, and then you have to go through and provide the plan, species, average minimum widths, buffer linear length, and that riparian buffer management plan has been included in the plan set. And then again, how you're going to protect it. So that part is very similar to the way if you're proposing a buffer. And again, the waiver information, this is only available for E&S permits. So we're not going to even touch on it. It's not available for GPs or IPs. And then again, the certification, the applicant name, and then the applicant's signature. So the reason why I'm making sure to call out that the applicant needs to sign some of these things is that there's a bunch of stuff that now needs to be signed by the applicant. So when you're all done, you're going to want to provide that to them and make sure that those things are signed before you submit. So it's going to be one more step for you guys to go through to get multiple things signed. And it's probably a good idea to hold your client's hand through that so they make sure they get all of them, because you would hate to have this, you'd hate to have to chase down a client after the fact to try to get signatures as a completeness item. Yes.
Could you go through the corporate rules about who's allowed to sign as applicants? Because we deal with an awful lot of organizations with multiple tiers.
It's in the instructions, and that's the best information I can give you is to read through that. If you come into a situation where you have an individual who is very difficult to get a hold of to sign, what they can do is provide a letter that says this other individual in that organization is allowed to sign on their behalf. We have that with a number of the larger facilities in the area that, you know, the top dog, the president, vice president, is very hard to get a hold of, sometimes not even in this country. So they write a letter delegating that responsibility to perhaps an environmental manager.
I think I'm okay, but just in case. Okay. All right, I promised you when you got back to me, we're getting close. I'm going to touch on a couple new things, and some of this will just be review at this point. So like we said, the checklists are now split into two different checklists. One is the NOI checklist and the other one's the individual checklist. They should be completed to make your application complete, and they're put together to make sure you have a complete application. There is a fact sheet found in the standard operating procedures that you can look at. It doesn't have to be submitted with your application, but it's good when you're putting it together to use that fact sheet as a final check. I think we covered this in pretty good detail, that there is a difference for the non-discharge, when you have to use the non-discharge and the ABAC BMPs, especially when you're using, looking at impaired or TMDLs. So I'm going to skip over that. One thing I want to swing back around to is the expiration dates and effective dates. This is a little bit new, where your PAG-02, your effective date, when you can actually start construction, is the same as the issuance date. For the individual permit, it's the first day of the month following the issuance dates. So your effective date, say your permit got issued today, the effective date of your permit would not be until March 1st. So that's a little bit of a difference currently. The expiration date to cover again, for the PAG-02 would be December 7th, 2024. For the individual permit, it's still 5 years from the, it's actually effective date now. So 5 years from that March 1st example, actually be February 29th this year, because of the leap year, is when the 5 years from that date would be when the permit expires. Somebody mentioned this before, but the PAG-02 is already issued, so it has to be, you have to sign on for coverage as it's published. We can't make any changes to that permit. The individual permit, we can add site-specific special conditions. So if you get an individual permit or your client gets an individual permit, there may be special conditions on that. And it's important that you look at those special conditions. We'll review them during the pre-construction meeting, but it's important to see what those special conditions are on the individual permit. And you may see more and more of those as we move forward. This is something we wanted to stress. The applicant must sign the PNDI. And in the Chapter 105 program and the Chapter 102 program, the applicant has to sign the PNDI. You can no longer fill out Section 7 and 8 for your applicant. They have to sign it. It's especially important when there's avoidance measures. Those avoidance measures, they're agreeing to fulfill those avoidance measures. They have to be on the ENS and the PCSM plan. So it's not enough to have them listed in the PNDI, you have to put those avoidance measures on the plans. If they cannot meet or they choose not to meet those avoidance measures, there is a procedure. They can continue with the process with whatever agency that is, that has the potential impact. But if they're agreeing for those avoidance measures, it needs to be on the plans and they're agreeing that they're going to fulfill them. Another change that you might not be aware of is with the individual permit public comment period. It hasn't changed for the general permit. It's published once at the end upon the permit action. For the individual permits, it's still published twice, but it'll no longer be published after the application completeness stage. It'll be published at the end of the technical review process as a draft permit decision. This will be both the draft permit decision and the notification that the application is complete. And then the second public comment period will be after the permit is finally issued. So there's a 30-day calendar period that now will be written in at the end of the technical review process. This is mentioned on again before, but I just want to point out that the transferee and the co-permittee forms are now two separate forms. The transfer application is not going to look like anything you've seen if you've only worked in the stormwater NPDES program. It's going to look like the rest of the NPDES program, so the industrial waste discharge, those kind of things. So it's found with the rest of the NPDES programs, and I suggest referring to that link that we have on the resource page to try to find it, because it's not in where you normally would be looking for it. Another thing that's changed is when you do transfer a permit, you need to file, again, the proof of the instrument that the PCSM plan BMPs. You have to do another filing if there's a transfer. So you're probably aware that when a permit is issued, you have to file within 90 days attach the deed, the plans. That has to happen again when the permit is transferred. The co-permittee acknowledgement form is still signed by the permittee and the co-permittee, but once they fulfill that, once they sign it, that form is valid. You'll no longer get a letter from the Conservation District saying that we acknowledge the co-permittee form. Once they sign it, and they still have to send it to us, but once they sign it, it's valid that they're now a co-permittee, as long as it's filled out correctly. So we covered new procedures, concepts, we identified a lot of new forms, and we discussed the spreadsheets. I'm not sure, Lori, do we have, I don't know where she is, but Drew? Time for some questions, is that one? Yeah,
definitely.
we're good if you have some questions. I'm going to probably bring the panel of the four of us back up here, if anybody has any questions, but.
Why are the individual permits not effective until the first?
The question is, why are the NPDES permits not effective until the 1st of every month? If you want me to, you can answer that.
So in the future, we are looking towards going, like the other NPDES permit, having a yearly fee. And the system that's already set up can only charge, I guess you can't do it based, and so they're formulating it like the other NPDES program. So it's at the beginning of the month, then until you NOT, there will be, and this isn't with this one, this is to come. So they're just trying to get it set up, and that is why the effective date is
The first.
the first.
Yep.
For rate control, for the alternative calculation method,